हेलो, वेलकम बैक टू द चैनल। तो चलिए हम पढ़ते हैं एथिक्स, ये वाला GS4 का जो है सिलेबस है, बुक है, टॉपिक से जो भी हम पहली बार पढ़ेंगे, एन इंट्रोडक्शन टू एथिक्स। ये बुक देखो, केविन गिब्सन, ये वाला बुक जिसका मैंने एक इंट्रोडक्टरी वीडियो ऑलरेडी बनाया था कि ये बुक क्यों पढ़ेंगे, एक्चुअली किसने रिकमेंड किया है और क्यों हम पढ़ रहे हैं। चलिए, तो ये देखो पियर्सन का पब्लिकेशन है, तो डेफिनेटली अच्छे बुक होंगे। हम पढ़ते हैं इसे। कंटेंट चैप्टर 1 आज पढ़ेंगे, ठीक है, और चैप्टर 2 तक पढ़ने की कोशिश करेंगे। मॉरल फाउंडेशंस एंड देन फर्स्ट चैप्टर इज फिलोसॉफी एंड एथिक्स। तो चलिए, बाकी सारे क्या देखना है, हम डायरेक्टली चैप्टर पे जाते हैं, इंट्रोडक्शन वाला। आइडियाज चेंज द वर्ल्ड। Every revolution and every transformation in human history has been based on an idea about what makes individual lives and communities better. Ideas frame our world, linking us to the past, giving the present relevance and meaning. Wow. And allowing us to project ourselves into the future. They provide context for our lives and offer the promise that things can be different. Some ideas are ideals that guide us by articulating a conception of the best possible way of being. Others are practical constructs that help us shape our lives by expressing what our priorities should be and where we should direct our energy and resources. क्या बात कर रहे हो भाई? When we analyze or assess our ideas, we evaluate them. Yes, we craft value systems. The values we adopt might arise from many sources: our upbringing, education, experiences, or personal reflection. But values are dynamic, and our encounters with the world might render what we once held dear to be less important, or they may completely change the way we think. Ultimately, our values underpin our deliberations, guide our behavior, and give purpose to our lives. They shape our identity and steer our actions. Values are captured by concepts such as right and wrong, fair and unfair, good and bad, just and unjust, and others that are often hard to label. A student believes the right thing to do is to never cheat on an exam. A child claims that getting a smaller allowance than his older brother is unfair. A diplomat accuses another country of human rights violations. A society views with disgust some unfamiliar practice of another cultural group. Values tend to be the most influential motivators for human action, even more powerful than economic incentives or orders from authority. People work for money and generally comply with laws or regulations, but they rarely risk their lives for those things. Yet, time and again, people are willing to die for ideals such as freedom, faith, honor, or glory. Generally, we do well enough on our own without looking too deeply into issues. But there are times when we are confronted by new or difficult questions that demand some reasoned framework for analysis. In this text, we will examine the foundational value-based concepts that we use to understand and govern our actions. With the help of philosophy, we can look critically at the assumptions at work behind our judgments to see if they necessarily lead to their purported conclusions. Perhaps we can even propose better ways of thinking about the issues. Sometimes we find ourselves reflecting on our assumptions after a dramatic event with wide publicity suddenly puts them into sharp relief. At other times, we are just unsatisfied with how things are and wonder if they could be improved. The issues we often ponder and deal with are not only the big ones that dominate our actions, but also those that maybe at first glance appear trivial or inconsequential. This is typical because we live our lives in a series of small encounters with one another. Consider the following questions. Should we allow people to engage in dangerous activities, or should we encroach on their liberty by regulating them? Should we hold companies responsible for injuries their products cause? Should we favor some groups over others, or should we treat everyone exactly the same? In healthcare, what determines the best way to allocate limited resources? Do we spread out as much as we can to as many as possible, or use some other means such as personal ability to pay? Should we educate students in the sciences or emphasize the arts? What women and men have the same rights worldwide? All these questions have embedded assumptions, and part of the role of philosophy is to bring these unstated ideas to the surface and examine them in some detail. Philosophy helps us make thoughtful and reasoned choices that others can defend. Philosophical thinking, whether or not we realize it, helps form the principles that we use to shape our communities and ultimately the way we deal with others, other nations, and the planet. Many people want to make the world a better place to live, a fine and noble goal. However, in practical terms, our value based or ethical decisions turn out to manifest themselves in mundane encounters. The way we treat individuals in our daily lives and in the scores of decisions we make all the time about our consumption and disposal of goods in our market economy. Nevertheless, it is important to appreciate that these routine decisions are framed by general principles that have long been the subject of philosophical inquiry. This book introduces you to the central concerns of classical and contemporary ethics, using examples and cases to highlight particular issues, so how theory can inform our discussions and reflect on how we ought to treat one another and the world around us. ठीक है, तो यहाँ तक हमने इंट्रोडक्शन पढ़ा। बाकी चैप्टर के बारे में समरी है तो ये हम नहीं पढ़ेंगे, हम थोड़ा सा इंट्रोडक्शन पढ़ लिया, काफ़ी अच्छा लगा पढ़ के तो मेरे को। ठीक है, एक बार रीडिंग लगाया तो ठीक है। ये जो क्या है सब्जेक्ट मैटर होंगे, आई थिंक इंटरेस्टिंग ही होंगे, क्योंकि इंट्रोडक्शन पढ़ के तो ऐसा लगा कि लाइफ की बात कर रहे हैं, फिलोसॉफी की बात कर रहे हैं, और डे टू डे लाइफ में हम कैसे डिसीजन लेते हैं उसमें उस सारे चीज़ों को उस सारे चीज़ का कॉन्टेक्स्ट में ये मतलब जो टॉपिक्स है वो इवॉल्व करेगा। ठीक है, तो देखते हैं। पहला चैप्टर है देखो, फिलोसॉफी एंड एथिक्स। तो ये दोनों में क्या फ़र्क है वही पढ़ना होगा, अंडरस्टैंड करना होगा। हम देख रहे थे वीडियोस कुछ इसके बारे में कि एथिक्स का आंसर कैसे लिखा जाता। तो शिविन सर, फिर सत्यम जैन सर एंड ISPCS पाठशाला, ये सारे ने लगभग, और कुछ टॉपर्स की इंटरव्यू भी, तो सारे ने लगभग मैंने यही कंक्लूजन पाया कि देखो आप एथिक्स का पेपर में आप यहाँ पर थ्योरी आप पढ़ोगे, बट लिखने के टाइम थ्योरी आपका कोई काम नहीं आएगा। आपकी जो अंडरस्टैंडिंग है वो आपको वहाँ पर लिखना है, और हर एक आपका जो भी लिखोगे उसको करंट सिचुएशन का एग्जाम्पल देकर उसको सपोर्ट करना है जो भी आप बताओगे, है ना। तो वो एग्जाम्पल देना ही सबसे यहाँ पर डिफ़िकल्ट काम होगा। बाकी तो खुद से मन से भी आप किसी चीज़ को एक्सप्लेन कर सकते हो, बट बाकी वो जो करंट इवेंट से कोई इंसिडेंट को आपको वहाँ पर रेफरेंस में लाना होगा कि ऐसा हुआ है तो यहाँ पर ये होता है ऐसे करके जो भी है। Okay, so we all have beliefs and opinions that shape our lives. We often do philosophy when we question our assumptions and demand clear meanings, and we can do it without reference to grand theories or technical jargon. However, arguments often grind to a halt and become a contest of wills unless we look more closely at some of the ways people come to their opinions and link them to various conclusions. So, what is philosophy? Philosophy is both an activity and a body of knowledge. Philosophers are rarely content to accept the status quo at face value. We want to know not so much how far we have gone in quantifiable terms, but instead whether we are on the right track. It would be wrong thought, though, to think that philosophers agonize over every decision and policy constantly. That would make everyday life impossible. However, we sometimes face serious issues individually and as a society when it is appropriate to take the time to reflect on what we are doing and why. Thankfully, many great thinkers have contributed to a body of knowledge that will help us sort out questions that vex us at this very fundamental level. Not everyone has to dedicate his or her life to philosophy, but it offers tools to help us confront and resolve some of life's most difficult problems or to recognize more clearly what makes them so troublesome. The discipline of philosophy is often associated with the seminal thinker Socrates. At one point, Socrates angered the city fathers of Athens so much that they put him on trial for his life on the charge of subverting the youth. According to the Plato's dialogue, the apology Socrates' response was telling, "For if you kill me, you will not easily find another like me, who, if I may use such a ludicrous figure of speech, am a sort of gadfly given to the state by God, and the state is like a great and noble steed who is tardy in his motions owing to his very size, and requires to be stirred into life. I am that gadfly which God has given the state, and all day long and in all places am always fastening upon you, arousing and persuading and reproaching you." इसका तो ज़्यादा समझ में नहीं आया कि मीनिंग क्या बोल रहा है. ठीक है, हम पढ़ते हैं. हिज पॉइंट इज दैट, हाँ इसको एक्सप्लेन कह रहा है कि वी कैन मेंटेन द वे थिंग्स आर, बट देयर इज वैल्यू इन रिविजिटिंग आवर वर्किंग बिलीव्स. दिस इज ट्रू स्पेशली व्हेन वी फेस नोवेल और डिफिकल्ट इशूज. One function of philosophy then is to critically examine basic concepts and ideas and their wider implications for everyday life. By providing us with the analytical framework to examine ideas and competing claims, philosophy allows us to see if they are valid and justified. For example, one theory of justice suggests that we should help those who are unable to benefit from the virtues of the genetic lottery, intelligence, health, aptitudes, and even the capacity to do hard work. In other words, the theory suggests we have a responsibility to help others who have, through no fault of their own, a more difficult struggle to survive and prosper. A contrasting theory, however, says that we are entitled to whatever we earn and we don't owe anything to anyone else. By this reasoning, if we are able to use our genetic gifts to generate wealth, we could help others, but doing so remains our individual choice. When we look at these sorts of claims more closely, we realize that there is more going on than a simple matter of arbitrarily choosing this or that theory. If we explore the basic assumptions people make, then we have the possibility of finding areas of agreement and at the same time testing whether our own intuitions lead clearly to the conclusions we draw. For instance, it might seem obvious at first that we are entitled to what we earn and should spend it how we wish, but it turns out that people disagree about notions of property ownership and the scope of personal choice. Engaging in open dialogue with others, analyzing their reasoning and evaluating our own challenges us to explain and justify our views and perhaps revise them if our logic or basic beliefs are somehow faulty. Philosophy may not give us the means to reach conclusive answers. In fact, it frequently raises more questions than it resolves. On the other hand, it raises the standard of justification from assertion to argument. An assertion declares something without any support or need for justification. An argument is a connected series of claims leading to a conclusion, and when we proceed to examine every step in the series, we find that each individual claim may be true or false, or the links between them may be invalid. In philosophy, all assumptions are up for re-examination. For instance, if we talk about why we should keep our earnings, we have to consider what it means to have the right to property, and if that comes about by virtue of the society in which we live. Additionally, we might consider our duties to others and whether our ability to earn has a consequent responsibility to help the less fortunate. Philosophers contend that it is always worth reflecting on our foundational beliefs and the way they play out in our actions. As Socrates famously observed, the life which is unexamined is not worth living. While this phrase can be read in many ways, it chides us to reflect on our purpose and goals in life. We can go along from day to day, but it suggests that perhaps the best life is one where we have taken the time and effort to think deeply about what we do and why. भाई आप तो मेरे को लग रहा है कि हम सेल्फ हेल्प बुक की बात करते हैं, बट पहले तो हमको एथिक्स का बुक पढ़ लेना चाहिए कि कोई भी यूपीएससी दे या ना दे, बट एथिक्स का बुक तो ज़रूर पढ़ लेना चाहिए एक बार। मतलब यहाँ पर वही लाइफ की बात हो रहा है ना। सो फिलोसॉफी एज ए डिसिप्लिन गिव्स आ स्ट्रक्चर एंड टूल्स दैट विल एनेबल आस टू डू दैट वेल। जो बाय द यहाँ पर फिलोसॉफी की बात हो रहा है, बट लाइफ में फिलोसॉफी उतना काम नहीं आते, बट हाँ एथिक्स तो ज़रूर काम आएगा। So these tools include logic, which enables us to examine our reasoning to ensure it is consistent and reaches valid conclusions. The history of philosophy, which allows us to look at the works of philosophers across ages and cultures, so we don't have to constantly reinvent material that has been refined through discussions and criticism over many years, sometimes centuries. Sometimes centuries. Metaphysics, which deals with issues not readily addressed by science, such as whether we are minds and souls as well as bodies. तो देखो ये सारे जो भी कन्फ्यूजन, जो भी डिबेट्स होंगे, ये रियल लाइफ में मतलब यूज़ नहीं होते, तो बस ये ठीक है। तो ये फिलोसॉफी है। एपिस्टेमोलॉजी और द स्टडी ऑफ नॉलेज विच चैलेंजेस अस टू डिफेंड दैट वी रियली नो व्हाट वी क्लेम टू नो, बट व्हाट एवर वी डू इन लाइफ, behind everything we have got a philosophy. That is true कि we use philosophy every day, every second, I think, है ना। क्योंकि हम बीएड कर रहे हैं तो वहाँ पर भी था कि जो है फिलोसॉफी ऑफ एजुकेशन ऐसे करके था। करिकुलम डेवलपमेंट के लिए फिलोसॉफी एक बहुत एज ए सोर्स काम करता है। तो ये सारी चीज़ है कि हमारा लाइफ के हर पर्सपेक्टिव में हाँ फिलोसॉफी तो काम आता है, बट अगर हर चीज़ को हम फिलोसोफर की तरह उतना डिटेल में सोचने लग जाएंगे तो फिर ज़िंदगी थोड़ा वो बोरिंग हो जाएगा। चलो, व्हाट इज एथिक्स? वी कैन इनिशियली डिफाइन एथिक्स एज द स्टडी ऑफ द ओरिजिन एंड स्कोप ऑफ द लैंग्वेज ऑफ मोरालिटी। Study of the origin and scope of the language of morality. Morals are the values that may derive from a theory or set of principles that concern good and bad, right and wrong, justice and fairness. तो ये सब में philosophy है। Ethics can be construed as theorizing about the proper regulating mechanisms for our behavior. It tells us what to aspire to and also constrains our actions. तो ये ethics है कि क्या करना चाहिए कि नहीं करना चाहिए। It is informed by psychological elements, for example sympathy, generosity, compassion, kindness, concern for others, or even revenge or outrage. However, these traits can lead to confusing and sometimes conflicting impulses, and thus it is useful to codify them in some way. We can do that by using the power of reasoning to work out priorities, make our actions consistent. Sometimes what is morally correct, not correct thing to do, right? So that is ethics. Okay, so we can do that by using the power of reasoning, क्योंकि वहाँ पर रीजनिंग के द्वारा हम डिसाइड करते हैं टू वर्क आवर प्रायोरिटीज, मेक आवर एक्शंस कॉन्सिस्टेंट एंड प्रेडिक्टेबल एंड कम्युनिकेट आवर आइडियाज ऑफ राइट एंड रॉन्ग एंड जस्टिस एंड फेयरनेस टू अदर्स. There are continuing debates about the origins and mix of our dispositions and reason. Some say that we can see the hand of the divine that allows us to rise above our animal nature, whereas others think that ethical practices are evidence of our evolution as a species. For the present, we can put those debates aside and recognize that all human societies exhibit morality. For example, cooperation, child care, and the importance of keeping promises. Yes, this is very important. Moreover, we not only have those traits but also are capable of critiquing and improving our behavior and perhaps that of others as well. What are the different senses of ethics? In daily language, we use the term ethical in a variety of ways. Sometimes when we talk about an ethical person or discuss others doing something ethical, the connotation is that a person is doing something unusual and praiseworthy. For example, we may use the term to refer to people who do deeds such as serving at a soap kitchen, as if their actions are somehow distinctly heroic or saintly. We might suspect they are content with either less material wealth or less free time than we are, or perhaps they were born with an exceptional disposition to serve others. The problem with this view is that it makes ethics remote and something which applies only to a select few, with the implication that the rest of us need not aspire to behave or act any better than we already do. In contrast, we can consider a compelling alternative by treating moral decisions in a broad sense as just as much a part of our lives as any other choices. We are not born with a full-fledged sense of right and wrong, but we learn through trial and error as we mature, and even people who do admirable deeds have inevitably made mistakes along the way. Thus, it is not a matter of such people living in a different reality of personal martyrdom or misguided notions of happiness. Rather, some people simply put more weight on certain values than others. Morality then should not be seen as some sort of special state for some individual saints in special situations, but as a common dimensions of the regular choices we all face routinely. Okay, so ethics is for everybody. When we live day to day, we probably don't ordinarily distinguish moral questions from all others, deciding in each such case whether to be good or bad. More typically, we judge people on their moral consistency in various situations and fault them if they adapt their values to changing circumstances around them. Thus, rather than thinking of moral actions as things like working in a soup kitchen, a more suitable model of morality might be to say that moral elements are mixed in with everything we do. We make choices all the time using a constellation of factors, one of which all will be the morality of the issue. The moral aspect is not always at the forefront and has to compete with other impulses and considerations. Consider when you buy soap, it probably matters that it is effective, smells good, and it's priced reasonably. The question of whether the manufacturer made animals suffer unnecessarily in testing the product may come into the decision, but it has to battle with the other considerations. Perhaps if the concern has been highlighted in the media or you as the buyer are particularly sensitive to the issue, it will tip your purchasing decisions. The point remains that for most of us, morality is not a separate and isolated activity, but part and parcel of our regular existence and the various choices we make. A narrower sense of ethical describes a set of rules or conventions within a specialized field. Thus, some institutions or professions have codes of ethics. These codes tend to give specific rules about particular situations in which members might find themselves. For example, a doctor is prohibited by his or her professional organization from having a romantic relationship with a patient, or an accountant doing an audit cannot invest in a company when he or she has discovered insider information not available to the general public. Significantly, although the doctor or patient relationship is a special and privileged one in our society, it is important to realize that medical ethics is not a distinct morality with a completely different set of governing principles. Instead, it operates as a special case that overlies a general backdrop of principled behavior, such as telling the truth or treating patients fairly. That is, we work from the very widest sense of common ethics first and then narrow it down to deal with even more special circumstances. Hence, it is important to begin by understanding the broad picture about the way individuals and communities have reasoned about the proper ways to treat one another. Seeing ethics only in a narrow sense may lead to two important misunderstandings. The first suggests that we have different sets of behavior for the various compartments of our lives: business, friendship, romance, and so forth. Someone with this approach might claim that we should behave differently in particular situations. All is fair in love and war, or business is business, where all morality depends on the situation. While this might be true in some limited spheres, it demands that the individual knows where the boundaries of each compartment are and that everyone involved has a shared knowledge of the appropriate practices. Thus, we expect to be fooled by a magician, perhaps, but in general, we operate with background conditions of trust and honesty. In normal interpersonal dealings, we anticipate that we are not routinely being lied to or constantly duped. As it turns out, moral infractions are dramatic in large part because they depart from the shared expectations we have and use in our everyday lives. To illustrate the point, imagine, for instance, what a world would be like where no one could ever be trusted and everything had to be policed constantly. Second, a narrow view implies that ethics is an external set of rules that we are required to follow, and slavishly doing so discharges our moral responsibility. If these are true, then being ethical would just consist in knowing the rules and obeying them. It would not allow the individual to question values enshrined in the code. In contrast, most of us have significant freedom and discretion in the way we behave, and there is considerable latitude in the interpretation and application of the rules we live by. Even voluntarily joining a rule-oriented organization such as the military or a religious order involves initial assent by recruits, which represents their individual moral choice. Taking an expansive view at the outset creates a baseline of mutual understandings which can then be refined or made more specific as necessary. Philosophy and ethics provide powerful resources for navigating both the more difficult fundamental questions and problems. अच्छा, तो यहाँ पर बताया कि philosophy and ethics both are essential, ठीक है, both are complementary, and problems we face, and subsequently for those decisions we make in our regular activities, interactions, and relationships. Can ethics give us answers? A complaint about philosophy in general and especially ethics is that it does not provide us with answers. Philosophy, ethics does not provide us with answers. This suggests that the goal of ethics is to come up with a computer-style algorithm where we feed in the facts and issues and get a neat answer to our problems in return. While this has considerable appeal, think about what it would be like if we had this ability. When faced with a value question, we would fill in some sort of questionnaire, feed it into some impersonal machine, and then follow its commands to the letter. Suppose, for example, we are puzzled about whether to use our limited resources to either provide medical care or install traffic lights at an intersection. Both have the potential to save some lives and the cost is roughly the same. We could vaccinate a large population and ensure that, say, 5 people would not get a deadly disease. Alternatively, we could install traffic signals likely to prevent most accidents in a location that has claimed roughly the same number of fatalities over the last few years. We go to our computerized program, respond to a series of prompts on a screen, and get the response to use the money for vaccinations. But how does that make you feel? Would you be comfortable delegating your moral decisions to a third party? In effect, that is what we are asking if we demand a definitive answer for each case we encounter. Wow. First, we might legitimately worry that all factors have not been included in the decision. An automated questionnaire may fail to consider all the relevant factors. Perhaps the vaccine has its own associated risk, for instance, and these need to be brought into the deliberations. Or perhaps some people may feel that there is a morally relevant difference between acting and failing to act. Although the results may be the same, these concerns would need to be factored in somehow. Indeed, however we structure the formulaic questions around a moral issue, there is always a nagging feeling that there is more to be asked to pin down the most important aspects of a case at hand. Moreover, we might be concerned about the way the computer was programmed, what assumptions are made, and what approaches are chosen if there are two or more opposing viewpoints. A program might give more weight to some factors than others or make logical links between issues that we might dismiss as unimportant. This software could, for example, give great importance to the fact that drivers have responsibility for their driving, whereas it is hard to blame someone for catching a virus. Still, such a link is not completely self-evident and universally accepted. Even if the machine had flawless logic, we would still likely have some objections to the guiding principles it uses to reach its conclusions. One recurring theme in ethical thinking is that you are ultimately responsible for your own moral decisions, and there is rarely someone else better suited to make them on your behalf. Consequently, ethical theory does not do the work for you. It is a tool that gives an analytical framework to help make appropriate distinctions and discover some of the more subtle areas in a moral argument. Hence, it won't by itself provide answers, and perhaps it is the process of thinking through a problem that emerges as the most valuable part of reaching a suitable answer. Theory will help provide the critical questions about which factors ought to be considered in our decisions. Yes, theory will help provide the critical questions about which factors ought to be considered in our decisions, what sort of principles ought to direct our behavior, and how we should act. Summary: ethical theory is tremendously helpful when we form our arguments and conclusions. Eventually, we may adopt a specific theory completely, or we may choose to draw elements from several established theories, or we may combine some of their insights to create something new and unique. Whatever approach we take, studying ethics will enhance our thinking, giving us a theoretical conceptual apparatus with practical implications. Thus, clarifying the questions and discovering what an adequate answer will look like are the least we can expect from studying philosophy. At its best, it can provide us with new perspectives and a richer understanding of the world and our place in it. As we go through life, we will encounter moral issues. We will inevitably need to make choices to take stands one way or another. We are all individually responsible for choices we make and for the consequences of our personal philosophical views and actions. Good arguments takes the time to lay out the groundwork and various positions involved, and experience suggests that it is therefore wise to give time to reflection, yes, and balanced consideration about what constitutes right and wrong before we make important decisions. So to make important decisions, you need to give time, okay, to think, to reflect decisions unreflectively in the heat of the moment. Okay, so about what constitutes right and wrong before we make important decisions unreflectively in the heat of the motion. तो कोई भी डिसीजन unreflectively heat of the motion में नहीं लेना. Okay, now moral foundations. Either consciously or unconsciously, we all operate within a moral framework. Occasionally, though, it is helpful to explore the boundaries of our behavior or question how things are always done, especially when we face new or difficult situations. In both ethics and science, we tend to start from our experiences. We encounter the world and recognize phenomena in it. The seasons change, apples drop from trees, only the mast of an approaching ship at sea is seen before the rest comes into view, and so forth. We operate on a few assumptions about the world without necessarily doing the fundamental science to explain what we see, and yet at the same time we in particular scientists find it helpful to generate a theoretical basis for these phenomena to make them more predictable and useful. Similarly, most of us have a general sense of good and bad behavior that serves as well in our everyday dealings, but at some point considerable value in developing a theoretical framework allows us to critically examine, conduct, and make recommendations about how to live better lives. Ethics and the law. A common reaction to moral issues is to say that we can simply look at the law, which will provide the answers we need. Hence, if we want to know if it is appropriate to freely share electronic files with others, we consult a lawyer who will tell us what to do. This approach has the virtue of being clear and directive. In general, following the law will be sufficient in most cases, and if you are uncertain about what to do, it is the safe option. The law has moral foundations, and the policies that are enacted are deliberated in much the same way as ethical theory has framed them. For example, there is a legal idea called eminent domain, where a community can legally override the property rights of an individual. It is generally applied in cases where the community feels that the welfare of the many outweighs that of the few. If a city wants to extend an airport to increase commerce and there is a house in the way of a proposed runway, under the law of eminent domain, the community can demolish the house to make way for the runway. The policy is based on a results-based theory, looking at the beneficial consequences overall, not just at the impact on the individual, and could possibly be defeated if opponents could show that the purported benefits were miscalculated through flawed evidence. In contrast, we cannot legally extract blood from someone with a very rare blood type against his or her will. This is based on the philosophical principle of personal autonomy, which sometimes conflicts with theories based on overall benefit. Hence, it appears the laws does not come fully formed, but in large part has been drawn from deeper philosophical commitments. तो ISPCS पाठशाला ने उस चैनल में उन्होंने बोला था कि ऑक्सफोर्ड का एक प्रोफेसर था, क्या मैं भूल रहा हूँ, तो उन्होंने एक फ़िलोसॉफ़ी के ऊपर कोर्स बनाया है, और वहाँ पर ये मैंने एक ही वीडियो देखा है अभी तक, ठीक है, तो बहुत सारे वीडियोज़ हैं, तो उसको देखने का रिकमेंड किया है। तो अगर आपको नहीं पता होगा तो ज़रूर सर्च कीजिएगा वो वाला वीडियो, ठीक है, बहुत अच्छा लग रहा था मेरे को देखने में, और बहुत मतलब वो वीडियोस काफ़ी इंटरेस्टिंग है। प्रोफेसर काफ़ी इंटरेस्टिंग तरीके से डिस्कस कर रहा है, पढ़ा नहीं रहा, पीपीटी प्रेजेंटेशन नहीं कर रहा है, पूरा हॉल में बहुत सारे स्टूडेंट्स हैं और उनमें वो प्रोफेसर एक एक करके एग्जाम्पल दे करके सारी चीज़ों को एक्सप्लेन कर रहे हैं और स्टूडेंट से ही उन्होंने वो क्या मतलब कोई क्वेश्चंस का आंसर ले रहा है और फिर उसको काउंटर क्वेश्चन कर करके, मतलब बहुत एंगेजिंग है लेक्चर्स, ठीक है। आप देखोगे तो मतलब बहुत अच्छा लगेगा देखने में। चलो, सो hence it appears the law, okay, if the law and morality are identical, it would be impossible to have times when an act could be legal but not moral, or conversely moral but not legal. Perhaps an employer in a developing country legally may not have to provide workers with the latest safety gear available and required in the United States and Europe. Some people may think that failing to do so is morally inappropriate, but the employer is not breaking the prevailing law. In another example, consider your view of abortion. If the law were changed overnight, would it alter your opinion about its morality? Probably not. And hence we are dealing with two distinct approaches, one that is governed by laws. तो देख रहे हो सारे एग्जाम्पल का ही खेल है यहाँ पर, आपको रिलेवेंट एग्जाम्पल पुट करना है। प्रोबेबली नॉट, ओके कहाँ पर रहते भाई ये, and hence we are dealing with two distinct approaches, one that is governed by laws and one that is based on morality. Although they may often overlap, they are not interchangeable. There can also be times when morality may tell us to go against the prevailing legal standards, perhaps by staging a protest or refusing to be enlisted in a draft for a war perceived as unjust. The fact that the two realms are distinct and do not always overlap tells us that we should not automatically say the legality of an action necessarily implies that it is moral. Thus, while following the law is generally a very good threshold for moral behavior, it should not be an absolute yardstick for morality. This is especially true in cases where technology develops more rapidly than the law, for example in cases of sharing electronic data or using social media. Another key difference of law and morality is in the focus of moral responsibility. If we make our own decisions about right and wrong, they can certainly be informed by our sense of ethics, legality and convention, but ultimately we have to take the responsibility for our own choices and acts. Imagine a hypothetical world where we constantly defaulted to the law as our guide. It would be full of legislators making the law, police enforcing it, and judges assessing punishments for those who transgress. We would all have to become encyclopedic about the current regulations. However, in reality, the law is not static and uniform. Lawyers are hired to interpret the law in a way that best favors their clients. ये अच्छी बात है कि lawyers are hired to interpret the law in a way that best favors their clients. वेरियस रीडिंग्स, क्योंकि दोनों का ही लॉयर होता है तो दोनों ही उस क्लाइंट के फेवर में बात करता है। Various readings of the facts, issues, precedents and appropriate regulations show us that the view of morality as the law leaves us with a state of affairs that ultimately resolves into the same kind of debates that we currently find within philosophy itself. Ethics and religion. Philosophy and religion also overlap in many areas, but they are distinct fields and deal with ethical issues from different perspectives. They may reach the same conclusions. For instance, both would probably agree that taking the life of an innocent is wrong or that charity is good. However, the starting point and methodology will be different and the two should not be confused. Religious commitment involves alignment of one's life with a divine being. Ideally, every action is an attempt to be more harmonious with a supernatural force that informs and guides the life of a believer. The divine may be known by a revelatory experience, perhaps through encounters with texts such as the Bible, a religious organization like a church or a spiritual being. Typically, a canonical text is considered to be divinely inspired. Further, the mystery of the religion invokes faith, and the believer will accept some basic tenets. On that basis, certain teachings are held to be authoritative and intertwined with the faith insofar as questioning them would be regarded as heretical. A further hallmark of religion is its various rituals, including worship and prayer. In contrast, philosophical inquiry does not require an act of faith. In the Western tradition, at least, it favors rational argument to demonstrate its conclusions, and it fosters analysis and debate. Texts are not held to be immune from criticism, and indeed, much of the discipline involves close critical reading and responses to classic works. No single text is held to be authoritative, and the history of philosophy often reads like an unfolding dialogue that emerged from earlier works. These differences are significant when we consider the study of ethics. A religious approach will demand some connection with the supernatural and certain dogmatic assumptions that fuel moral action. For instance, the Commandments that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai give many people an ethical anchor, but at the same time, they may feel that these religious laws are immune to interpretation or criticism. That is, people feel the commandments should be obeyed simply because they come from God, and therefore they do not need any further justification. Even though a philosopher might agree with the Decalogue as a set of moral principles, he or she need not start from the same place. We could imagine that they could be considered a reasonable set of conventional rules to govern a society, but it is not essential to philosophical inquiry to make reference to a spiritual author. Although ethics do not depend on a religious backdrop, it need not be antagonistic to those with religious commitments. For a believer, religion typically governs one's whole life and not just morality, and many philosophers have deep spiritual lives that are based in faith. At the same time, they feel it is worthwhile to engage in inquiry about the nature and scope of moral behavior. Saint Thomas Aquinas, for example, argued that a life of faith can be congruent with philosophical investigation based on logic and experience. The religious believer might maintain that a full and rich life requires knowledge of the supernatural, a view contested by the atheist. However, as an empirical matter, an ethical life need not depend on being religious or having any particular faith or worldview. We can see this because someone could create a moral system and live a good life without any reference to a supreme being. We can have both theistic and atheistic ethics where we scrutinize the consistency of the recommended behaviors and their outcomes. For instance, whatever the origin of a moral intuition, it would be appropriate to question theories that lead to suffering or oppression. Certain ethical attitudes will spring from religious beliefs, to be sure, but the philosopher can examine them on their own merits without having to question the underlying faith commitment. Conversely, someone of faith should not see ethical theory as a challenge or threat, but rather as a useful analytic tool which is capable of refining and clarifying how we should treat one another. The nature of conscience. Another approach to morality is to say that we have an inner feelings or voice that tells us right from wrong. In other words, a conscience. For example, in the Disney movie Pinocchio, the character Jiminy Cricket cheerfully sings about letting conscience be a guide for your actions, leading us to believe that we can judge each moral question by reflecting on whether it makes us feel good or uneasy. Thus, for example, when faced with a choice of whether to pick at an answer sheet accidentally left on a teacher's desk or not, we might reflect on whether and to what extent we would feel guilty for being dishonest. Most of us have had this type of experience at one time or another. There is an issue of timing because having a conscience is often thought of as carrying a burden after the fact for having done something wrong. This dynamic is often portrayed in TV crime dramas where the confronted suspect voluntarily confesses all because the crime is weighing on his or her mind. This is not new. In Shakespeare's story of Hamlet, the title character arranges a play to mimic the apparent murder of his father by his uncle. The idea is that this will flush out the culprit because someone with a guilty conscience is troubled and will not be able to keep the secret indefinitely. Hamlet's uncle sees the play and storms out, which Hamlet takes as proof of his guilt. Despite widespread acceptance of the notion, many philosophers have questioned the very concept of having a conscience, believing that it may just be shorthand for some other psychological dynamic at work, such as conforming to societal norms. Let us look at it more closely. First, do all of us react similarly? If we all had the same moral sense, then perhaps we would all react similarly when faced with moral choices, or at least those who choose the wrong path would regret their actions and seek to redress them. Laura Bohannan, an anthropologist, lived among the Tib people in Nigeria. She was confident that the story of Hamlet would have universal meaning and told them of a chieftain killed by his brother and the desire for vengeance by the dead chieftain's son. To her surprise, the Tib interpreted the story quite differently. They thought that the brother was the proper heir, and instead of being shocked that the queen cut short her mourning and married the new king, they thought it entirely appropriate. Their cultural framework shaped their moral judgments, which are at odds with Bohannan's. It appears that moral judgments based on conscience have to be taken in the context of the society and its conventions. Perhaps what we mean by conscience is an immediate response based on our sense of conformist judgments, where we assess our actions in terms of how others in our cultural group would respond. So that is the conscience. Additionally, various opinions about the moral acceptability of practices such as the treatment of animals suggest that conscience may be a function of upbringing just as much as nature. As children, our behavior is largely influenced by others, mainly our parents. We are encouraged to behave in specific ways and rewarded or punished accordingly. If we are taught to protect, love, and care for animals, for instance, our response to killing animals for sport may be condemnation. However, if we are encouraged to believe that killing animals for sport is actually a means to practice a survival technique, we may be more open to the idea. Similarly, some feel guilty when engaging in activities such as jet skiing or disposing of plastic in landfills, which may harm the environment. Others have no problems doing so. If conscience is really a function of our human nature, then we should all react to issues similarly, which is clearly not the case. Hence, it is difficult to establish what is actually in an innate, raw, or unbiased response because of the influence of others beginning at very early stages of life. Furthermore, conscience can be fluid in nature. We can imagine someone who is reluctant to steal office supplies from work but is told by her co-workers that it is no big deal and that everyone does it. The reluctant employee may take a ream of paper but agonizes over her action all night long, even though she realizes there is a very little likelihood of being found out, and even if she were, the consequences would be minimal. A few days later, when she runs out of toner for her home printer, she decides to take some home, this time justifying her actions by telling herself it would never be missed, and that she is worth more than she is paid. Sleep comes more easily this time, and after a while she is completely undisturbed by her actions and would not even describe them as morally wrong. तो change हो जाता है. The issue here is that even if we hear that inner voice of conscience, we are adept at ignoring it or interpreting it in various ways. The remedy might be to assess potentially moral actions quietly and reflectively, but there is no guarantee that our findings will be any different from the justifications we have already made. In other words, this may be a case where we choose to explore multiple kinds of justification without any real governing principle to arbitrate between them, and whether decisions are made hastily or at leisure would not affect their validity. Conscience is used in another sense when we talk about people who have stood up for their beliefs and face punishment as a result, as in the phrase "a prisoner of conscience," describing someone who will not recant political views in the face of a repressive regime. In a slightly different sense, the term has recently been applied to cases where, say, a pharmacist refuses to dispense birth control pills to a customer because of his personal religious beliefs. However, conscience in this context need not be referring to the mysterious inner voice. These cases describe a mode of behavior that is based on an individual moral stance. The fact that some people are willing to make sacrifices based on their strongly held personal beliefs does not by itself verify that they are responding to an unprejudiced moral sense or that their views are any more correct or justified than others. One of the continuing issues in the ethics is the difficulty of putting our conscience about behavior into words and then persuading others or being convinced by their arguments. If we leave conscience as a lurking, subjective voice, then we will preclude that possibility. But if we think of it as a useful starting place reflecting primitive ethical intuitions, it opens up the opportunity for moral discourse and arguments. Ethical projects. Other approaches place ethics in the context of a wider project. For example, some theorists will argue that our current ethical views are shaped by evolutionary biology, asserting that we have successfully survived as a species because we have developed psychological mechanisms that promote cooperation and nurturing. This is known as sociobiology and draws on work in zoology and anthropology. In this case, it is plausible that ethics could be reduced to a natural science of observation and prediction. Others believe that mankind is unique among the animals, set apart because of our ability to reason. Natural law theorists believe that human nature reveals fundamental truths reflected in the way we behave, that is, that we form family units. Oftentimes, natural law is used in conjunction with theistic worldview, which suggests that we have been created with certain natural dispositions to the good and the right by God, and our mission is to discern those truths through reason. Some take the ethics project to trace the implications of deeply rooted convictions about the nature of people and existence. For example, foundationalists believe there are certain core moral anchors and there are both sacred and secular versions of this thesis. For instance, many believe that the key moral precepts are the 10 commandments found in the Old Testament of the Bible, and any ethical question can be answered by reference to these few central ideas. However, the set of core tenets, तो देखो ये जो बुक है ये आई थिंक अमेरिकन ऑथर ही है ना, नाम से पता चल रहा है, तो इसलिए शायद ये टेस्टामेंट और इसका एग्जाम्पल दिया है. तो पता नहीं ये कितना काम का होगा, देखते पढ़ते चीज़ें समझ में आ रहा है तो ये हम ईजिली यहाँ पर मान लो इंडिया का जो भी ऐसे रिलीजियस बुक्स है तो उससे हम इसको क्या कंपेयर कर ले सकते हैं, रिप्लेस कर सकते हैं. However, this set of core tenets need not to be religious in nature. We could create a system of similar moral claims without reference to a divine origin. Their project typically involves a marriage between these central tenets and prescription about the way people should behave. Then theists are not concerned as much with immutable truths but try to understand the justification of moral language in terms of its internal consistency. For example, if someone says human life is invaluable, coherentists ask if the same line of argument be used for both the debates about abortion and capital punishment. Dealing with these kinds of knotty problems, coherentists believe will help establish sound analysis that can be applied to difficult or novel cases. Ethical egoists believe the fundamental moral unit is the individual and he or she ought to always promote his or her own good. This means the person does not accept external values, whether they are from conventions, laws, or divine commands, unless he or she sees them in his or her interest to do so. The egoist may cooperate with others, but ultimately the arbitrating factor in making any ethical decision is whether there is any personal payoff involved. An egoist viewpoint is often seen at work in the literature of strategy and business. The relativists focus on the idea that there are no fixed points in ethics and all claims must be expressions of preference. Just as some people prefer coffee and others soda, decisions about lying, cheating, or stealing are considered individual expressions of personal choice. So what goes for one person or group applies only to them but has no privileged status. That means it should be imposed on anyone else. However, as a practical matter, we don't live in societies where anything goes and standards are rarely arbitrary. Thus, the relativist is challenged to explain why some behavior should be encouraged and others sanctioned. Cultural relativists accept the claim that there are certain acceptable conventions within a community and look at the differences between different societies. This leads to a view that ethics is a societal construct but should not be regarded as reflecting any objective or universal truths. For example, bullfighting is popular in Spain but would be considered barbaric in some other countries, or the government has a say in family size in China, which many in the West would consider an infringement of a basic human right. Yet at the same time, some countries have gone to war with others to prevent genocide or liberate repressed people, and the cultural relativist faces the challenge of justifying such acts. Thus, there are clear differences in diverse approaches to the study of ethics and the objectives involved. Whatever someone's starting point, though all these perspectives are open to critical scrutiny, and philosophers have created strong arguments on all sides. The benefit from these clashing views is that every objection demands that the proponents respond with ever greater clarity and sophistication. In the next section, we will look at the various strategies that philosophers use to tackle ethical issues and some of the key distinctions they use to present their arguments. Varieties of philosophical ethics. The study of ethics is often broken down into a number of subfields. As the discussion becomes more specific, technical terms are used to clarify the distinctions. Although not everyone would agree with the distinctions or accept the classifications, it is nevertheless worthwhile to grasp an overview of the various schools of thought. Descriptive ethics. Descriptive ethics focuses on an actual behavior. Thus, if we say we care about buying dolphin-shaped tuna or recycling, but if the research shows people are unwilling to pay more or alter the way they act, then our talk may be less significant than our actions. In studying ethics, we can gain useful self-awareness from empirical research in descriptive ethics. Even if the particular manifestations of morality differ across time and culture, all societies have had a sense of what constitutes justice and goodness, and descriptive of practice are useful in working out the emergence and application of value-based attitudes. To understand descriptive ethics in a broader context, let us begin with simple statement: all human societies kill animals for sport. This is a descriptive sentence. It is important to notice several features of the sentence. First, it is a statement. That means it asserts a fact which can be either true or false. Philosophers sometimes use the term proposition or propositional content when discussing the truth or falsity of a fact, asserting or declarative sentence. Statements, however, need not be true. Their function is to make a claim along with conditions which would either affirm or deny it. In this case, if a society venerates its animals and never kills them for sport, then the claim is still a statement, but as it turns out in this case, a false one. Second, by itself the statement conveys no value. It only says that the activity takes place. We may react with alarm, disgust, or a complacent shrug, but the sentence does not demand any specific response. The same would be true if research indicated that 1/3 of all job seekers lied on their applications, but these empirical findings do not tell us whether such actions are good or bad, only that they happen. Professionals in certain disciplines, zoology, anthropology, psychology, specialize in examining human and animal behavior and report their findings. For example, zoologists tell us that dolphins support sick companions and will push them to the surface to breathe. Anthropologists report that poor people give proportionally more of their incomes to charity than the rich, and psychologists indicate that bystanders tend to avoid helping others in an emergency. These researchers do not present their conclusions with an ought to, instead they leave it to us to draw our own moral implications. A note of caution is appropriate, as it is not unusual for merely descriptive sentence to have an embedded persuasive element. For example, in the following: no decent society kills animals for sport. The word decent imports an implicit value element into what initially appears to be a neutral statement, and so we always need to be very wary insofar as some words and phrases introduce a personal bias that frame statements likely to alter the perceptions of its audience. Meta-ethics. Meta-ethics looks at the nature of moral language, how we use it, and ask questions about the meaning of moral utterances. Additionally, it touches on a range of other issues in philosophy, since it questions the knowledge claims involved, which is the province of the branch of philosophy called epistemology. Since metaethics is largely concerned with examining moral language, the key elements are conceptual analysis and examination of the reasoning involved. If we have good reasons to accept some ideas and reject others, and we can concur on ways to ascertain the validity of certain claims, then we are morally more likely to identify flawed ways of thinking, such as vague terminology and sweeping conclusions, and move toward moral consensus. The work of writers in this area often discerns the set of beliefs that people have and the reasons behind what they say when describing their own values and trying to influence those of others. For example, here is a sentence with an explicit value component: it is wrong to torture kittens for fun. In exploring the nature and meaning of the sentence, we could ask whether it is a statement of fact or an expression of personal feeling. If it is a fact, then it is fixed in a certain context, for instance, here and now, or is it true for all people everywhere and always? If it is an expression of a personal view, could someone's views ever change, and should other people hold the same belief? These sorts of questions are important in discovering how ethical discourse functions. If you dislike the idea of torturing kittens but feel that other people are entitled to their own opinions about how to treat their animals, your view won't have much leverage in persuading others to alter their behavior. Alternatively, you may take the position that torture of any animal is and always will be wrong in any circumstances, and that your claim is on par with scientific facts. Mathematics is usually divided into two camps, cognitivism and non-cognitivism. सॉरी क्या पढ़ दिया, मेटा एथिक्स होगा ना. मेटा एथिक्स इज यूजुअली डिवाइडेड इनटू टू पार्ट्स, कॉग्निटिविज्म एंड नॉन कॉग्निटिविज्म, ईच विथ इट्स ओन सबफील्ड्स. कॉग्निटिविज्म फ्रॉम द लैटिन वर्ड cognoscere, meaning to know or to recognize, is the philosophical view that moral statements make knowledge claims. Thus, cognitivists believe that moral statements reflect fact and they should be treated in the same way as other factual claims. Importantly, they don't say that all statements are true, only that they are capable of being shown to be true or false someday. In some cases, as we may not yet conclusively know the truth, but a hypothesis is susceptible to prove that future technology or research will provide. For instance, consider the claim that pregnant women who drink over 300 mg per day of caffeine or 8 cups of coffee may cause birth defects in their children. While we may not have a definite answer to at the moment, in the end the claim itself will turn out to be either true or false. In the same way, cognitivists talk about moral claims such as X is bad or Y is unjust very much as if they were irrefutable statements about the world, just like sentences about gravity or electromagnetism. Similarly, the cognitivist may say that the mission of ethics is to determine how best to obtain the truth or falsity of moral statements and deny that there is any room for personal interpretation. Hence, it may indeed be true that it is wrong to torture kittens, and the cognitivist maintains that such a statement has the force and irrefutability of a scientific claim. It is important to note that moral disagreement does not necessarily undermine the cognitivist view. Just as people historically have had the false perception that the world is flat and the idea has been subject to scientific discovery, individuals may get their facts wrong about morality. Nonetheless, the cognitivist holds out the promise that one day we will have the appropriate means to establish the truth one way or another. Cognitivism is typically broken down further into naturalism and intuitionism. Naturalism asserts that moral talk turns out to be shorthand for natural facts, that is the kind that can be established through demonstration or scientific proof. Thus, the naturalist believes that we can translate moral terms into physical, sociological, or psychological hypotheses that can subsequently be tested. For example, it could be that torturing kittens for fun is wrong, means most people disapprove of torturing kittens, or all sane people release certain brain chemicals when they witness the unnecessary suffering of kittens. The preceding statements are simple and crude, and most naturalists would say that once we parsed out what we mean by good or wrong or other value components, their meanings will end up being far more complex and subtle. At the same time, naturalists believe with research and sufficient data, the study of various cultures and human physiology will yield scientific findings corresponding to the value components of our sentences. That is, they believe there is no mysterious quality of good or right that could not be reduced into descriptive sentences of observable data. One view along these lines is that given sufficiently advanced imaging of the brain, for example, every value statement could be translated into a fact about brain states, with the corresponding belief that value differences may be explained as chemical imbalances in the body. Some philosophers, notably G.E. Moore, feel that naturalism rests on a fallacy. They say that any purported translation from a value statement to a factual one will fail to fully capture its meaning. The evidence for this is that we can always ask, but is it good, to any factual claim. For example, if the naturalist maintained that ending malnutrition is good, translates into all sane people approve of ending malnutrition, or even all humans react with the release of certain brain chemicals when confronting malnutrition, Moore would say that The factual statements are still subject to the value question of whether all people approving something makes it good, or whether our bodily responses tell us how to judge something morally. Moore himself represented another cognitivist school known as intuitionism. It accepts that moral statements can be determined as true or false, but contents they arise from a human sensibility that we all share, which enables us to determine right from wrong. It explains apparent variations by saying our moral senses are often clouded and we need to refine them to make accurate judgments. If we had appropriate clarity about moral questions, they argue, we would achieve universal agreement. Someone who relies on conscience alone would be an intuitionist, and as we have seen, he or she faces the task of explaining a sense which is elusive and unclear to many. In its defense, we cannot deny that often people have similar experiences and reactions to some moral issues, such as intuitions that promises ought to be kept or that babies should be cared for. As an analogy, think about the nature of love. Many people experience it and are more certain about it than many other facts. They could be persuaded by that they are subject to perceptual mistakes, but will maintain that their experience of love is raw and immediate. When asked to explain what it means to be in love or how they could demonstrate it to others, they find themselves hard pressed to do so. However, we don't necessarily give up on the concept of love just because it is hard to explicate, and the intuitionist would say much the same about our moral sensibilities. Non-cognitivism, in stark contrast, focuses on the belief that moral language expresses or exhorts only our personal attitudes and is incapable of expressing objective facts about the world. One non-cognitivist view, emotivism, suggests that a moral statement translates into a sincere representation of our reactions, such as the idea of torturing kittens. ये क्या होगा? They would deny that there are universal moral facts and believe that morality is a question of personal reactions which may vary significantly. Another version, prescriptivism, gives additional force to our reactions by suggesting that our responses and utterances not only express a personal view, but they serve to encourage others to think the same way as well. For example, torturing kittens is wrong and you should think so too. The cognitivist or non-cognitivist split is not the only way of slicing the metaethical pie. An alternate version uses the terms realism and anti-realism. In ethics, a realist is someone who believes there is an objective truth of moral claims. That is, the realist would say that there is a reality to moral matters that does not depend on individual perception or interpretation. A realist would assert that there is something we perceive about the act as we understand it, and we recognize this reality in our moral assessment of the act. Therefore, all realists are cognitivists insofar as they posit that moral statements have a factual basis. In the 1930s, W. D. Ross, an English intuitionist, claimed some duties such as doing good and preventing harm are self-evident and obvious, and are therefore real because the moral assessment by anyone with normal sensitivity would always be the same. Conversely, the anti-realist position asserts that there is no objection moral reality, implying that all anti-realists are also non-cognitivists, but that does not necessarily mean that there are no standards or that all moral decisions are a function of individual preferences. The anti-realist denies that there is any ultimate moral reality, but at the same time is likely to agree that we live by a set of practical conventions. To explain, let us try another analogy. People build dwellings which take various forms with functional elements such as sleeping areas and dedicated spaces for cooking and bathing. We would expect to find some basic concepts such as sound structure and weatherproofing as part of any design. However, these do not show there is some objective or ideal form that a home should manifest, but rather that humans tend to react to their surroundings in similar ways. Some aspects of a dwelling will depend to a large degree on the environmental conditions. Architectural and aesthetic values will also vary depending on the particular time and society in which we live. For example, the Soviet Soviet regime favored brutal concrete buildings, whereas other cultures look to spectacular ornamentation. The point is that in a human endeavor, it should not surprise us that basic common features come about from functionality and others vary by emergent conventions. The same could be said of a wide range of activities such as sports, the college curriculum, or the discipline of philosophy. From within the convention, there are certain ideas of better or worse, but when we look at each activity as a whole, it is clear they have been crafted by our own design. Thus, we prize strength and agility in many sports, but these often represent ancient martial qualities and are traditional rather than natural. We could just as easily value elegance, balance, and endurance. Similarly, the subjects we study at college and the way they are approached has developed from a set of accepted conventions. But we can imagine a radically different approach, perhaps one that involves service, learning, or requiring life skills training. The anti-realist view in ethics does not deny that morality exists. Instead, it claims that human societies have developed a set of functional and mutually beneficial standards for behavior that are social constructs and do not represent an objective or eternal moral reality. The common features of the convention simply mirror that works best in any human community. Hence, while these codes and principles are internally consistent and we often find similar behaviors praised and sanctioned, anti-religion maintains that they reflect the most practical or efficient functional underpinnings inevitably emerging as part of humans living together. Normative ethics deals with setting norms or standards. In other words, it asks what we ought to do. Normative ethics is divided into two subfields: ethical theory and applied ethics. Ethical theory deals with the theory and justification of moral principles. It tries to explain what is good and why that is so, and what makes an act right. If we return to the kitten case, we might say that torture is wrong because it causes unnecessary suffering, or that it degrades us as human beings. We are now able to move beyond mere assertion toward providing principles to support our claims about what we ought to do and why we ought to act. However, these principles need to be justified, not just asserted, which involves developing arguments showing their internal consistency and coherence. There are several levels of justification in which we often move from looking at individual judgments to developing a universal rule and establishing a general principle. Applied ethics, also called practical ethics, applies the principles of ethical theory to particular focused areas and cases. Philosophers in these areas make explicit arguments about how we should behave in specific cases. For example, there is considerable literature that applies ethical analysis to human rights, the environment, or the treatment of animals. Other areas deal with concerns where special standards might apply. For instance, in medicine, issues such as confidentiality and informed consent are examined. In the law, there are questions about attorneys as jealous advocates, and in business, what the appropriate levels of social responsibility to the surrounding community should be. Many philosophers have had little difficulty in bridging the gap between ethical theory and its application. Their works are peppered with examples to illustrate the points they make, and so it is difficult to maintain that theory is divorced from application. Nevertheless, other philosophers believe it is most useful to deal with the theoretical backdrop in isolation before we can apply theory in particular cases involving practical decisions. Traditional ethical theories fall into three main groups: consequentialist, deontological, and virtue-based. Consequentialist theories, as the name suggests, look at the potential results of our actions to determine whether they are right or wrong. Deontological theories arise from the Greek term deon, meaning duty, which focus on motives or intentions. For example, there are cases where the greater good might be served by breaking a promise. Perhaps a recently decreased relative had extracted a debased promise that you spend a huge amount of his money on a monument to his memory, but you want to donate the money to a worthy cause instead. The tension arises when we have to discern where the moral focus should be on the potential benefits. As a consequentialist, would, or on the motivating obligations and duties as a deontologist would. Virtue-based theory does not represent direct principles or rules that would indicate what the best course of action is in particular cases, but instead tells us what matters most is developing a worthy character, suggesting that who we are is more significant than what we do. This theory looks at someone's actions over the entire sweep of his or her lifetime and judges him or her by the way he or she engages virtues guided by a core set of values. Some ethical theories are described as teleological, from the Greek word telos, meaning end or destiny. The general idea of teleological theories is that life should be purposeful. The consequentialist might say that we should work to increase overall welfare by doing the maximum good for the maximum number, whereas others could argue that we should try to do our moral duty और लिव इन हारमोनी विथ नेचर और ग्लोरीफाई गॉड। तो ये मैं काफ़ी रिलेट कर पा रहा हूँ उस वीडियो के देखने के बाद, ऑक्सफोर्ड वाला जो कोर्स है, कि वहाँ पर भी ऐसा ही एक वो जो प्रोफेसर था उन्होंने कॉन्टेक्स्ट दिया था कि एक ट्रक आ रहा है रास्ते से और उसका ब्रेक फेल हो जाएगा, तो एक साइड वर्कर काम कर रहे हैं, एक साइड 5 वर्कर है, एक साइड 1 वर्कर है। तो ये जो बोला ना कि मैक्सिमम गुड फॉर द मैक्सिमम नंबर, तो 2 ऑप्शन था ड्राइवर के पास कि वो 5 को इधर उसको क्रॉस करे या फिर स्टीयरिंग को थोड़ा इधर करके जो अदर साइड में जो 1 पर्सन काम कर रहा था उसको जाके क्रॉस करे। तो कुछ ऐसा कॉन्टेक्स्ट देगा, तो ये सब चीज़ें वहीं पर था, तो थोड़ा थोड़ा तो समझ में आ रहा है ज़्यादा कुछ पढ़ने में इंटरेस्टिंग है, बट अभी तो वो है ना डॉट्स को कनेक्ट नहीं हो रहे, मतलब कुछ डॉट्स बने ही नहीं। तो अभी डॉट्स जैसे हम पढ़ते जाएंगे वैसे ऐसे हमारा डॉट्स बनते जाएंगे और फिर बाद में जाके कनेक्ट हो जाएगा। ठीक है, देखते हैं। ओके, सो ए try to do some moral duty. A virtue theorist might say that all human life should be aimed to encourage human flourishing, using all our gifts to fulfill our best potential. Recent challenges to ethical theory. The accepted teachings in ethical theory have been radically questioned in contemporary times. Feminist philosophers have suggested that classical views may have ignored some of the special concerns of women and insights they offer. These philosophers confront many of the assumptions that have been presented in the ethical canon. For example, the role of reason has often been held to be dominant in contrast to that of emotion, which has typically been described as a feminine trait and downplayed in moral discourse. Postmodernist philosophers have a wide range of perspectives on ethics in general. They react against the modernist assumption that academic theoretical discourse has a privileged truth-telling function, and they look to the experience or phenomena of what goes on when we use ethical language. Postmodernists may claim that the concepts of ethics allow us to organize our experience in certain ways or construct notions of what it would be like to have an ideal life. Their focus shifts from looking at morality as a distinct practice to trying to make sense of the world through experience informed by ethical language. In other words, each of us constructs our own narrative based on our lives, and the function of ethical language is not so much to argue as it is to present a story that makes sense to others. Summary. A frequent reaction to any ethical inquiry is often for people to rely on an immediate intuitive response and then try to persuade others through various theoretical techniques. Parents, for example, will often engage in moral instruction by simply telling a child that something is wrong and threatening punishment if questioned. Nevertheless, at the end of the day, this kind of approach is unsatisfactory. It leaves no room for questioning, argument, or progress in the ways we determine basic and everyday notions of right and wrong, good and bad, or what is fair and just. The nature and scope of ethics can initially be intimidating, especially in its use of technical language and fine distinctions. Yet there is real value in looking at ethics by systematically distinguishing the various starting points and assumptions at work. Further, once we have established some common foundations, it will allow us to develop principled arguments to defend our views and persuade others through rational argument rather than assertion or bigotry. It is worth examining ethical claims in such a rigorous and methodical way, since they may govern some of the most important features of human life, including ordinary interpersonal behavior, social policy, human rights, the environment, and ultimately issues of life and death. तो यहाँ पर हमारा चैप्टर 2 कंप्लीट हो गया और हमने लगभग 30 पेजेस, यहाँ पर 30 पेजेस नहीं, यहाँ पेजेस 22 पेजेस, आई थिंक 21 पेजेस ही पड़े हैं। ठीक है, तो ठीक है, आज हम यही स्टॉप करेंगे और फिर हम नेक्स्ट वीडियो में ये चैप्टर 3 से पढ़ेंगे। चलिए, थैंक यू, गुड नाइट।